back, everybody, to the Radical Moderate podcast. I am your host, Pat O'Brien, and today I am joined by Gary Moody, who is the vice chair of the Arkansas Advanced Energy. Welcome to the show, Gary.
Thanks, Pat. Good to see you.
So, before we get started, tell the audience a little bit what is the Advanced Energy Association in Arkansas? What does that mean? What do you do?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. The Advanced Energy Association in Arkansas represents a variety of new energy technology companies, everything from wind, solar, battery storage, wood pellet production, geothermal, energy efficiency, um, sort of the whole gamut of advanced energy solutions, and particularly my expertise an area in that is on the grid side, the transmission grid side. So there's a lot of um, newer technologies that can strengthen our grid as well that fall into that bucket of advanced energy solutions.
And how long have you been kind of around the energy sector, working in various roles?
About 15 years in various roles, and started my career from the environmental angle. Um, Actually, my very first brush against it was trying to help some clients um, get their products listed for energy efficiency rebates in Arkansas, um, which is a pretty arcane process, but making sure they met the qualification standards. But then joined Audubon, Arkansas as their policy lead, worked in and around that office for about a decade, and eventually was over 31 states energy policy for Audubon when I left there a couple of years ago, and then joined a grid focused philanthropy organization where I am now.
Well, let me just say it's probably by a factor of 10x how much more that you know about energy than I do. So let me go with a baseline question here. If you had to explain to a smart but not technical audience how the US energy system actually works, and I'm talking from generation to transmission to plugging something in the wall, how would you describe that?
Yeah, dude, that's a great question. First of all, once you understand it, it's amazing that it does work, right? It's literally the world's biggest machine. There's three main components. There's generation, how we actually make the electrons, whether that's coal plants, gas plants, nuclear energy plants, or solar or wind. But that's the generation piece of it. How do we actually physically make the electrons? Transmission is, I think, the interstate highway of the grid system. It's the big power lines that move power long distances. There's not as much of that as you might think, because our utility system was created as a bunch of sort of islanded fiefdoms, right? And you probably know this from your lived experience. When you move, oftentimes you get what? A new energy company, right? When you move that up to Fayetteville, you got a new energy company, right? Because
Right.
you crossed an invisible seam that like none of us really know exists, almost like political boundary maps. Utilities have boundary maps, right? They have service territories, and in most states, not all, but in most states, um, the customer base is captive, meaning where you live determines who your electricity provider is. That's how it is here in Arkansas. And so, um, in that mix, you have some that are vertically integrated, meaning they control generation, the transmission, and the distribution, which is the last piece of that. So I talked about the generation and the transmission earlier. The distribution is the last mile. It's the wires that actually go from the substation and connect to each and every home or business in the state and provide power specifically to your fuse panel. That's the distribution network. Um, and all in all, these things have to balance 100% of the time, meaning the amount of energy that we are producing has to equal in real time the amount of energy that we are using. So every time when you come home from work and you flip on your lights, and maybe you start the dishwasher or whatever, out there somewhere, there's a grid operator who is looking at that load change and having to respond in real time by ramping up or ramping down generation. So when you put it like that, it's
I,
amazing to me that it works.
No, I think that's a great comment. And for people who've seen movies or traveled extensively, I know one time I went on a mission trip to Honduras, and the issue wasn't reliable electricity. The issue was they didn't have electricity in most of the villages that I was visiting and helping with. So I'm sure we're lucky in that regard, and it's probably not luck. It's probably hard work and smart people doing things. So let me ask this question: what would you say works better than probably people realize about our current system?
Um, the amount of times that you come home and flip the switch and the lights come on. The U.S. has really, really high reliability scores. I mean, 99 point, plus reliability scores, right? Meaning we take it for granted, right? Like that when you come home, your power is going to be on. And so that is a credit to the folks who work very hard to make sure that happens, right? And to make sure that happens, we built safeguards into the system. We have what they call reserve margins. We have plenty of safeguards in the system, redundancies built in, right? Um, so that if one power plant has to go down for unexpected maintenance, there are others that can fill that void, right? Um, Now that impacts costs, right? Because we live in a world where supply and demand are real things, even in that space, right? So if the supply goes down and the demand is high, the costs go up. But a lot of that's coming into tension right now, and people are starting to tune in, I think, more to the electricity system because we're in a very unique time where the grid is facing pressures at a level that it hasn't faced in a long time. For the last 35 years, load growth has been essentially flat, meaning the same, right? Because, yeah, we were growing, but those gains were being offset by things like LED light bulbs, more efficient appliances, right? And so overall, the total net load was staying roughly flat. That's not the case now. Now we're forecasting a period over the next 10 years of pretty consistent load growth, right? Which means we've got to grow the system in order to meet that need. So that's one pressure. The other pressure is more extreme weather, right? Whether it's wildfires out on the West Coast or storms like Winter Storm Uri, which devastated the electrical grid in Texas. And so we can get into why that happened there. And even though we were sub-freezing here, we didn't experience that because I think there's a lesson to be learned there in that. Um, but we're seeing those more extremes, and those put a lot more pressure on the grid. And then, variable renewable resource integration is becoming more of a thing, right? So we are going from a time where um, almost 100% of the generation was you flip a switch, either it's on or off, right? And you can ramp up a natural gas plant like you can turn up the dial on your natural gas stove at home and get a bigger flame. You can do that to a degree in a natural gas plant. Like you can't make the wind blow harder when you want it to, right? You can't make the sun shine brighter when you want it to, right? Now those resources, when they're working, are the cheapest resources available. And that's important to note because that wasn't always the case. It's only been the case for like the last, 3-4 years that you can say that consistently, that when those resources are available, they provide the lowest cost energy, right? So we want to maximize our ability to use those while also making sure that we maintain the level of reliability that Americans are accustomed to.
Well, and you touched on a lot of things there, and I think one of the things, it was going to be my next question, but I think you already answered it, is, what's fragile about our system that people don't realize? And I think you pretty much addressed that. So let me move on
Well,
and
I
ask
think there's
this.
one more unique thing I didn't get to, Pat, that I want to make sure we also flag is that most of our grid was built in the 50s and 60s, right? During the think of like the time as of the TVA, rural electrification, and then the last big grid expansion time was the 50s and 60s, right? So that's important because the average lifespan that we assign to grid assets when we put them in the field is 50 years, right? Well, 76 was 50 years ago, right? So we've got a lot of assets that the past generation built and put in the field that are now at the end of their useful life, right? And they're starting to fail. So that's another sort of fragility that we're up against.
So within that context, is it a fair statement to say that from a generation standpoint of electricity, we can produce more than we can efficiently move through the grid, or is it in parity? Or is the grid actually up to snuff at the moment?
No, I mean, at the moment, yes, it's up to snuff. Now, what we are seeing is we're seeing those reserve margins are dwindling, and we call them peak times in the industry. So there are peak times, right? And it's maybe the best metaphor I've heard for this is like the size of the pipe, right? So if you got a water pipe coming into your house, right? The diameter of that pipe determines how much water you can get in your house at any given time. And that's kind of what we need the grid to do, right? So the size of the pipe isn't growing as fast as we need it to, right? Because we have to be able to meet that peak when on the hottest day of the year, when everybody's turning on their air conditioning to stay cool, right? The grid still has to work, right? On the coldest day of the year, when everybody's
Right.
turning on their heat, right, and doing all, the grid still has to work. And that's what I think a lot of people don't understand is that we have to build the system for those peak moments, right? And oftentimes it's those peaks that drive the bulk of the cost, right? Because you've got to build power plants. There's a lot of power plants out in this country. People don't realize this. We call them peaker plants. Maybe they only operate for 15 minutes a day for 2 or 3 days a year, right? But if the alternative was you had to, turn people off, right? So we have a lot of that built into the system. You have to be able to meet those peak times. I think that's something that a lot of people don't fathom, right? Because unlike a lot of countries in the world, we don't. For ease, we opted to treat every kilowatt hour of power the same from a pricing standpoint, from a market, like, right? We don't communicate to the consumer that the kilowatt hour that you burn at from 5 to 6 p.m. when you get home cost 5 times as much as the kilowatt hour that you burn at 11 p.m., right? Because we charge you the same, right?
Right. Well, and so there's a couple things I wanted to go on with that because I love talking about capitalism and markets, and I think that because I'm a huge capitalist, but I tell people it matters what the rules of that are and what that market rule is, and I think what you're saying is that there's kind of a socialization of the cost. I think they call it leveling on your build, and I don't do it, but I have the option of doing it. But are you basically saying the choice we've made as a country is to socialize that cost so that because some people might say, I want to just not use it at peak time and pay a lower bill, but that's not really an option. Is that what you're saying?
Not for residential customers. Now, we do have that available in the commercial and industrial space because those customers pay a thing called demand charges, which is a bigger component of their bill. And that demand is like, are you using at the peak time? What is your maximum usage at any given time? And a portion of their bill is related to that. So it rewards you if you can more evenly spread your use and keep it relatively even. So we do have some mechanisms for that, but the thinking early on was that residential customers weren't sophisticated enough as consumers to be able to respond to real-time price signals. And the technology now we almost all have smart meters on our home, and we don't even probably realize that the utility companies have switched them out, right? And gone from an analog meter to a smart meter, but they have in almost all of Arkansas. And so now for the first time, we do have access to that very granular real-time data of how much energy any given home is using at any given moment. But that's, again, a relatively new occurrence, right? And utilities and utility regulators are still figuring out, like, what are the best ways to make use of that data, right? So that we can evolve the system. But yeah, right now we've gone with a flat fee for residential. You pay 10 or 11 cents a kilowatt hour, period, right? Like, regardless of when you use it. And frankly, like, regardless of how expensive you are to serve, right? Rural customers that live in the middle of nowhere, they cost a lot more to serve than the customer that lives in a dense urban area. But we have made the policy decision to charge them roughly the same, right? So that, yeah, there are a lot of sort of smoothing out of the system for ease.
One of the things that I'm going to take away from this podcast is the term peaker plant. I just had no idea, and it makes perfect sense. Just how many of these peaker plants that are only operating very, very limited hours in a year would you say there are?
I don't know that I have a good ballpark. I mean, it is, I would say nationally probably in around 1,000. It's definitely in the high hundreds, right? Um,
And they just sit dormant, is what you're saying, like 90 to 95% of the year, and then they ramp up at certain times when they're needed.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, that's their whole purpose, right? Is to serve that peak. And it's only pretty recently that we've gotten sophisticated enough that we've realized it's actually, in a lot of cases, it's cheaper to pay a large industrial customer to ramp down um, than it
Oh,
than
okay.
it is to fire up, right? So we do those are called demand side resources. So it's actually we've now started thinking about that as a resource, right? Where we actually just pay, maybe we pay the paper mill in Pine Bluff, right, to ramp down, or large manufacturer, um, as opposed to turning on a very expensive generator.
Well, I want to come back to the grid in a second, but I think the analogies you were using, be it peaker plan or a lot of the things that are in place to just make sure, as you said, that when we flip the light switch, it comes on. It made me think of, I drive quite a bit for work and things, and many times I'm crossing the Mississippi River or I'm in Delta flatlands and that sort of thing. And so you see these massive levees, and on a dry day, you look at them and like, why do we have that? Now I know why we have it. It's because there's a few times where they're needed. And if the levee breaks, if the levee's not dry, then the levee breaks, it's a massive, really catastrophic problem for people. And so, yeah, we need levees in the grid system. And then one more thought I had was, I think we've all been in that situation, at least if you live in the South. It's July or probably more likely August, and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and now it's on our smartphones. You get a thing that's like, please don't use any more air conditioning or whatever, like, because you're just going to break the
That's
system.
right. Right.
Like if one more
Yeah,
person
that's right.
plugs in their toaster, the whole thing's going to fall to the ground. And I think intuitively we kind of get it and say, we need to act as a group,
That's right.
right? Like we're individualists and that sort of thing. But here, without knowing all the backstory, we kind of intuitively say, I'm sure these people are right because it makes sense. On a moment like that, though, Gary, what is actually happening? Like, what is going on behind the scenes?
Yeah. So what's happening is they do that as they see the reserve margin dwindling, right? And so sending out a conservation order is something that a utility doesn't want to do, right? And frankly, there is a policy debate about whether they work anyway, particularly at the residential level, because you would think we all want to work together, but there's at least some evidence that people get a conservation order and they go, "Oh man, the power might go out. I'm gonna crank my AC up and make sure my house is nice and cool now." Right, so they're like pre-cool it, So in some cases, it's actually been shown to have the opposite effect, right? At least in the short term. Now it does work well when we found in the commercial and industrial world when you compare it with a financial incentive, right? Then you align financial incentives;
Right.
those folks respond, and that has been proven to work. But what they're seeing is that if you go to a point where you have more demand, right? Like more people have things turned on than you can physically serve, then that's when you start getting brownouts and blackouts. That's when the grid starts to fail, right? Is it literally doesn't have enough power to serve, and that starts tripping fuses and the safety guards we put in the system. That's when the power goes out, right? And so that's the issue at hand, and that's part of why I'm such a big proponent of building out our transmission grid in a way that we haven't. Is I told you we've got all these like isolated fiefdoms, right? Um, and it's interesting. A bunch of folks have voluntarily banded together. Arkansas is part of two what we call regional transmission organizations, right? So we have the MISO, which is the Mid Intercontinent System Operator, and MISO spans from Manitoba, Canada, all the way down into Louisiana, and they operate the transmission grid for that whole region, right? They've got three control centers, and one of them happens to be in Little Rock. So they've got one in Little Rock, one in Indiana, and one in Eagan, Minnesota, where grid operators monitor, and they're like the air traffic controllers, right? They're the traffic cops of the grid. They're monitoring their flows. They're moving. So what that allows, though, in that footprint is for all of those individual utilities, right? For Entergy and even the electric cooperatives, but all those utilities can then share power resources with one another. They can share their generation assets. And specifically, the way they do that is they bid it into a day ahead market. They take all their generators and they say, tomorrow we'll be able to generate power at this cost, right? And then MISO starts stacking them up, right? And when they have to turn on, they turn on the next most expensive. And when they have to turn off, they turn off the most expensive one to make sure that we are economically maximizing the opportunity, right? And then West Arkansas, where you are in Fayetteville, or in Northwest Arkansas, is in Southwest Power Pool. It's a whole different 14-state regional grid operator. Arkansas actually is on a seam where MISO and SPP butt up against each other. Somewhere around Dardanelle is typically is where that line is, right? So like SWEPCO is in SPP. SPP's main headquarters is also in Little Rock, Arkansas. So like a lot of people don't realize Little Rock is a major electric grid hub in the United States, controlling about half of the state's grid is tied to control centers here in Little Rock. So that's kind of a neat, fun fact.
There's two questions I want to get to make sure I get the foundation of all this, because we've been talking about the grid.
Mm-hmm.
Let me make sure I know the definition. Is the grid, when the term grid is used, is that infrastructure and technology and people, or do you mean more specifically just the infrastructure?
Usually when we say grid writ large, we mean the three components, the transmission, the generation, and the distribution. Collectively, I often refer to those as the grid. You could lump in like the controllers into that as well, like the control centers and the command and control. But usually I'm talking about like the physical apparatus, right? And then we'll specify, like if I'm talking about transmission, I'll say transmission, or
I got you. Well, so first question related to that: if Gary Moody was put in charge as the czar of the grid with an unlimited budget and just said, Gary, we need a 50-year plan and it's on you, buddy, where would you start? Like what would be the things that you would you don't have to go to Congress. You don't have to talk to anyone.
Yeah.
Everybody works for Gary Moody. What would you start? What would you do?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's a lot of things, right? We think of the areas that need improvement. I call them, oftentimes we refer to them as the 3 Ps: planning, permitting, and paying, right? Those are the 3 Ps of the grid. So our planning has to get better. Often the planning for the grid is done in silos. The RTOs do a good job, but you have to keep in mind that RTO, Regional Transmission Organization membership, is voluntary, right? It's just a collection of utilities who've chosen to work together for economic efficiency purposes, right? So those memberships are voluntary, and they try to coordinate planning, but our planning writ large, in some areas it's great. Some areas, like in the Southeast, there's not an RTO, like in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, right? And all that planning happens in silos. And oftentimes, the planning window is simply too small. They're not looking far enough in the future, right? What people don't understand about transmission in particular is it takes on average in the United States 10 to 15 years to build a transmission line and put it in service because of our permitting regime and just the amount of time it takes to plan and study and actually get steel on the ground and electrons flowing across those wires, right? So that means our planning has to look at least that far into the future, or you're right, or you're just perpetually behind, because by the time a need shows up, it takes so long to fill it by building new transmission. That's increasingly problematic now when a new data center can come in and have a energy
Oh
demand
yeah.
that's roughly the size of the city of Conway, right? Like, I don't think people understand the size of power requirements for a lot of these things, but that's roughly the size of demand for an average data center is the whole everything else in the city of Conway combined, right? If that puts, so you can build a city's worth of demand in 18 months, right? You can build generation pretty quick, assuming all the supply chains and all of that works out. But you can build that in, say, 24 months to 36 months, right? 2 to 3 years. But if you've got 10 to 15 years to build the big power lines to connect it, right? Right? What happens is you get an incredibly inefficient system because everybody's got to build their own thing. And so if I was the czar, I think it's time for a Dwight Eisenhower U.S. highway plan for the grid, right? I think that there is a certain public good of like these super high voltage interstate lines to be able to move power from the West Coast to the East Coast and vice versa, right? Which we can't even do in this country right now. Well, I call it the grid. We actually have 3 grids in the U.S. right now. We have the Eastern Interconnection, which Arkansas is a part of, that goes from the East Coast to the Rocky Mountains. You have the Western Interconnection, which was built all on the west side of the Rocky Mountains, and then you have Texas, right? And seriously,
Well, of course. I
and
mean,
Texas,
everything's got to be independent in
that's right.
Texas. They can't participate with the other
And
kids.
Texas, they made the proactive decision years ago to not connect to the other states' grids because they didn't want FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to have jurisdiction over them, right? And the only way they could stay without FERC jurisdiction was to not connect. And so, if I mentioned Winter Storm Uri earlier, right? That has a real impact here that I think is worth looking at because we had similar temperatures and similar freezes, right? In Winter Storm Uri as Texas had. The impacts were completely different, right? In Arkansas, most Arkansans lost power for less than 3 hours during Winter Storm Uri, if they lost power at all, right? Why? Because we are connected to a grid that was bigger than the storm, right? We were able to import power from Ohio, from power plants in Ohio, carry those electrons over the wires here to keep us up and running, right? Because the local power plants here, a lot of them, the coal piles were frozen, right? So we couldn't get the coal into the coal power plants fast enough to keep up, right? Or to get them running at maximum efficiency. A lot of the gas wellheads were frozen, right? So the gas delivery system for gas power plants was interrupted. So by being able to bring power in from an area that wasn't impacted by the storm, we were able to quickly restore power when we lost it. In Texas, they had folks without power for 2 weeks. People died. I heard a story just yesterday of someone who said, yeah, I had a colleague in Texas that was literally burning their furniture for warmth, right?
Oh my God.
Because if you think about your life and how quickly, right, like being out of power for an hour or two is a nuisance, right? Being out of power for 4 to 8 hours, like you start worrying about like your food spoiling, things going bad, the temperature in your home becomes quite uncomfortable, right? Batteries on electronic devices start to dwindle, right? But as you go forward, those problems just compound and compound, and it doesn't take very long for it to, particularly if it's subarctic freezing temperatures outside, for it to become life-threatening. And in fact, in Uri in Texas, people did die, right? Because of the lack of power. And
Well, and let me say, I should have given you a warning. We're coming to the end of this episode, but here's what we're going to do. You'll be back for part 2 next week. We're going to broaden the discussion,
no,
but I had some big takeaways this week from peaker plants and understanding the grid at a much higher and deeper contextual level. And my biggest takeaway is we need to make Gary Moody the czar of the grid and just get out of his way and let him do his thing. So for those who are listening today, I appreciate it. Hope you learned something. And that is the POV of POB.